Would you kill a puppy? Would you kill a puppy that is trying to attack you? Would you kill a puppy in a video game? Would you kill an evil puppy that has the power to kill you in a video game? The likelihood of a person answering yes increases with each of these questions asked, and yet, strangely enough, answering yes to any of these inherently answers yes to the first one. If you would kill an evil puppy that is a threat to your survival in a video game, then undeniably you would kill a puppy. This is a strange exercise in observing the intersection of logic and morality. It's not something the average person ever really thinks about. The human brain has a remarkable way of avoiding this unfortunate fact, after all. However, years before becoming a worldwide name, living a humble, suburban, middle-class student life, a teenage Toby Fox did notice. Video games are an incredibly strange medium. They are the only medium in existence that is treated as the sheer product of the creator's intent, while simultaneously treated as something for the audience to shape and choose the experience of. Depending on who you asked, they are respectable pieces of high art unto themselves. Not art, but rather valid containers for art. Or just simply a perversion entirely removed from the discussion of artistic expression altogether. Strictly speaking, as a medium, they are computer programs. And computer programs can be, when you really think about it, anything. Video games can be anything. And yet, despite all this, take a moment to reflect on the medium. Think about its history. Think about all your favorite examples in it, and think about the most iconic and most popular examples in the medium. You have your party games, your puzzle games, your shooters, your platformers, your RPGs, your fighting games, your racing games, and everything in between. What is the single most common factor you see binding the medium? The answer is comically simple. Physical assault. In a world of infinite possibilities, this is how we chose to express our freedom more than anything. I don't have to explain to you how Undertale acknowledged and explored this fact about games, RPGs in particular, having such a big emphasis on physically beating down opponents. The game is utterly famous for the way it chose to establish parasocial friendships with the monsters over promoting the slaughtering of them. That is, of course, with the exception of perhaps the bigger reason why Undertale became famous. The content that can only be accessed by, in fact, slaughtering every monster. In this route, the G route as it's called, the true protagonist, or perhaps the true antagonist, Kara, explicitly emerges as the character being controlled by the player. And yet, for iconic as this route is, as meta and symbolism dense as everything surrounding Kara is, they remain notoriously underexplored as a character, both in terms of explicit lore information and in terms of thematic exploration. Last time I put an analytical spotlight on Kara, I came to a somewhat straightforward conclusion. Toby didn't explore Kara because, on an emotional level, he just can't. Toby isn't serious enough about storytelling to unpack things that make him feel uncomfortable. That was what I honestly believed before Deltarune Chapter 3 and 4 dropped. I no longer think this is the case. Like it did for many people, Chapters 3 and 4 blindsided me. It was no longer a matter of speculation anymore. Toby is exploring the concepts surrounding Kara, and he had been from the start of Deltarune. He was just doing it under our noses. Even though sparring and fighting make no meaningful difference, even though our choices don't matter, even though all fighting takes place in a make-believe world, Deltarune is a story about violence. Make no mistake. It turns out our initial impressions way back with Chapter 1 were correct. Deltarune is fleshing out the concepts introduced in the G route of Undertale. There's only one slight issue. Deltarune is way more complex than we could have possibly imagined. I'm not the first to point out that it might have more story motifs than uses of leitmotif on the soundtrack. Furthermore, a lot of instances of these motifs only show up in optional content, and often in vague ways at that. If that wasn't bad enough, the number of plot-relevant characters has ended up being a lot larger than Chapters 1 and 2 had us suspecting.
This has made theorizing difficult, to say the least. After grabbing the low-hanging fruits after 3 and 4 dropped, it quickly started seeming like we were just simply bottlenecked. If I'm to be honest, I've been feeling a bit of defeatist energy in the community, ultimately just resigned to wait for Chapter 5 at this point, which, fortunately for them, they have to wait no longer. Let me put this in no unclear terms. Chapter 3 and 4 do provide enough info to figure out the entire story, and I'm going to prove it to you. However, before we do that, what if I told you that the entire theorist community has been overlooking one of the most single, helpful chunks of Deltarune content? Throughout all the hunger to get more info, combing through the Spamton sweepstakes for all its secrets, turning chapters 3 and 4 upside down to find every little implication, losing all our marbles at the 10th anniversary stream, and then finally the email ARG, Dearest didn't take a step back for a moment and think about the benefits of removing information. I'm not trying to speak in Jevil-type riddles here, I quite literally mean, what if we could simplify Deltarune into a form much easier to digest? A form that makes the hierarchy of importance between these myriad of elements obvious and narrows down the list of possibilities dramatically. Well, yeah, that would be convenient if we could accurately imagine such a thing, but I mean, it's not like something like that is just gonna fall onto our lap. It did. Way back in 2011, 2 years before Undertale's demo would even drop, Toby was contributing to the soundtrack of Homestuck as it was experiencing parabolic growth and popularity. But that's not all that happened for Toby in 2011. 2011 marks the conception of Deltarune, born by a vision in Toby's fever dream. That is still the same vision that is powering the current Deltarune, despite the plans for the execution being entirely different. We have had a different, simpler telling of Deltarune sitting on our shelf, and we've just been letting it collect dust. Today, we're going to finally unpack it, and with it, expose the truth to Deltarune's most foundational mystery. What was the central plot, and by extension, the ending to this game Toby saw in his dream? I present to you Protorune. The first difference with Protorune is a glaring one. There are no Undertale characters, at least in the Light World. How do we know this? The Light World was going to be all humans. They were going to transform into monsters when in the Dark World. Now, there is one person that may be an exception to this, and you probably already know who I'm going to say. It's Sans. Sans is a skeleton after all, and what is a skeleton other than a dead human? Furthermore, this could be an easy explanation for Sans bleeding. But let's not get ahead of ourselves yet, because we'll be talking a lot about blood later. The next point is the difference between the Light World and Dark World is far more pronounced in Protorune, as confirmed by Toby. The original vision was to distinctly make the Light World feel bland and boring in comparison to the colorful Dark World. But once again, let me remind you, the characters would all be normal human beings, while transforming into monsters in the Dark World. Remember this detail. Elements of this vision made their way into the final draft, most notably in the way darker portraits are colored, while lighteners are left in the Undertale pure white style. But in general, the contrast between the Light World and Dark World is far lower than in Protorune. What this does confirm, however, is the various obvious fact that the Dark World is more idealistic, or at least the game is urging that perspective, and that this is true for both Protorune and the final draft. Here's another detail we can essentially confirm about Protorune. Toby's second main artist after Temi is the artist Gigi Gigi. Gigi's comic, Cucumber Quest, features a dark silhouette-type villain called the Nightmare Knight. In 2014, Toby composed a song as a tribute to Cucumber Quest. The very Kirby-sounding melody is similar to what can be heard in some places in Deltarune, but most importantly, Black Knife. With zero question whatsoever, we can assume that the knight in Cucumber Quest was the main inspiration for Deltarune's knight, and the knight, as it appears in the final draft of Deltarune, was meant to be the villain of Protorune. There's even a factor where the Cucumber Quest knight is spoken of a decent bit before the actual introduction of the character, like in Deltarune. The date of the comic aligns with Toby's dream as well. This keeps things nice and simple. We don't have to guess if Toby actually had some other type of villain he originally formed the story around. Now for one of the stranger details. Susie was not tough. This was not only explicitly stated by Toby, but we also have the details of her ponytail giving her a more feminine appearance, and the fact that her eyes were always visible from the start. We can also see in some sample dialogue that she just doesn't seem to be causing friction to the same extent. And now, finally, here's perhaps one of the most critical details of all. Sparing was not possible in Protorune. This has never been outright stated anywhere, but we have two sources that point to this being incredibly likely. First off is the prototype dialogue for what seems to be Jevil. A game filled with constant fighting. How banal. How trite. The removal of this line, to me, clearly spells out the original game was in fact filled with constant fighting, not just simply battles where you can pacify your way through. The next thing is Toby points out how the Undertale battle system isn't really the right fit, and the sparing through acts feels vestigial. The way he's associating this so strongly with the concept of Undertale distinctly and not insisting on it being there because of some original vision, to me says it wasn't there in Protorune. So then, with this new, simplified version of the story, what can we determine? Well, something is glaring us right in the face. It's a story where you fight, you attack opponents, and, in all likelihood, kill them. This only sounds weird to say because of the existence of Undertale, but recall the fact that this is just the norm for the average RPG. While not every RPG always implies you beat enemies distinctly to death, they do always typically only give you the option of beating on them. If we pair that with the other glaring detail, the way in which the escapist element is incredibly emphasized due to the high contrast between the light world and dark world, we get something shockingly articulate that, strangely enough, just doesn't feel so readily obvious in the final draft. It's the way in which the dark world is the dream come true of getting to experience a conventional JRPG journey. The type of journey in which you wield a sword, travel with friends, slay enemies, and grow stronger. Recall what I said. What is the most common fantasy of all granted by popular video games? Especially the ones Toby grew up with. Physical assault. The Dark Worlds provide adventure, magic, and colorful characters, but first and foremost, they provide the means and justification to be violent. Chris's Dark World attire is based on Ares, aka Varric, from Brandish. Brandish is a game where you kill or be killed, and grow stronger as you kill. Chris wouldn't don this form in land of hopes and dreams and ideals if there wasn't some kind of ideal seen in the way Varric lives. Toby himself has confirmed how much ideal he's always seen in Varric's character. This whole composition couldn't be more on the nose. You are living out the dream of being able to be a hero in a fantasy world. A hero that inflicts violence on their foes. So, am I saying that the final draft of Deltarune is using the options to spare as a red herring? Just a rug to be pulled and show us that, ultimately, this is an RPG, and in RPGs, we get violent if we want to progress. Well, yes and no. As far as being pushed into situations where the only option available is violence, this has, in fact, happened quite a few times at this point. It was hinted at as early as Chapter 1. King just happened to be a false positive as far as lack of reasonability goes. The Knight, however, strongly suggests no option other than violence, and the Titans in Titanspawn utterly confirm we are finding ourselves with nothing to do but slay or purify. For those who have played Off, a game that just happens to be one of Toby's major formative influences, and without question a foundational influence on Deltarune since Protorune, this purification term should immediately signal a certain synonym. That synonym is comically simple. Erasure. In other words, death. In other words, to purify is to kill. we are killing Titans and Titan spawn. The spare mechanic has already proved failable. Even Fluffy Boy Rouse, of all people, is borderline giving up on seeing any meaning to sparing by the end of Chapter 4. And let's not even get started on the implications of the sword route. All this said, there's a bit more to sparing and recruiting than just a rug to be pulled, but we'll have to sit tight before elaborating on that subject. At any rate, no matter how we slice it, both Protorune and the final draft are games dealing with mandatory violence, and that violence is against foes in the Dark World in the vein of a largely conventional JRPG. In establishing all this, we now can inherently establish the inverse of this point. The Light World is the opposite of ideal. The Light World, without a doubt, is the manifestation of what is lame, boring, ordinary, and most importantly, societal. There's been a lot of debate around Chris. Are they antisocial? How weird are they really? Do they hate us for invading their life? How do they feel about the Dark Worlds? But in the context of Protorune, I think it's not hard to tell at all. Chris is the protagonist, and Chris doesn't like their life in the Light World. While this composition might feel overly simple, everything points to it being true. In fact, if we take Chris's closest counterpart in Undertale, Kara, we flat out have confirmation that Kara feels this exact same way that Protorune Chris seems to feel. Kara hated humanity, and thus Kara hated living among humans. Kara saw life among monsters as an escape from humans, and much of their violence against monsters reflected the obsession with power that was fostered by their dysfunctional relationship with humanity. In Protorune, there are no monsters in the Light World to complicate things. Chris simply lives among normal human society, and Chris does not enjoy this. But here's another thing to remember. This isn't Omori. This is a Toby Fox game. Even though Toby might have been scared at how much superficial crossover there is between the two, I think we can trust this guy at this point to always lace the meta absolutely head to toe in his games. Something like Omori, where the real world exists simply because real worlds exist as opposed to Mind Palace fantasies, just wouldn't cut it for a Toby Fox game. Everything needs to be acknowledged as a game with some degree of self-awareness, and everything needs to fit into a bigger meta framework. Toby is examining the ideals that drove us to play games in the first place, the engine behind the golden age of retro gaming in the late 80s and 90s. So then, the Light World can't just simply be the real world. It needs to be acknowledged as a man-made creation of some kind. The role of the Light World is incredibly confusing, and it puzzled me for a long time. Back when Chapter 1 dropped, it was by far the factor getting everyone's interest the most for story anticipation. Chapter 2 is the portion of the story that most got us thinking of the Light World as simply ordinary, and the Dark World as idealistic escapism, especially thanks to Noelle's monologue regarding this, with only the Weird Root providing an argument to the contrary. But the Weird Root is weird, after all. It's easy to ignore. The post-Chapter 2 hiatus was so long that his perspective dominated us for a while. But 3 and 4 brought us back to the mentality that Deltarune is far, far more complex than just boring real world versus a world of escape. After all, it was thrown right in our faces that the Light World 2 had a stats system, and the interface for that stats system was identical to Undertale. When we see RPG systems in a Toby Fox game, that really can mean only one thing. It's a commentary about why we want to see these numbers in the first place. If Toby wanted to render Kara's monologue obsolete, he wouldn't have declared Deltarune a parallel story to Undertale and say it's for those who played Undertale. What Kara said is still applying to Deltarune. The numbers in the Light World are just as representative of the type of power fantasy ideals Kara speaks of at the end of the G route as much as the Dark Worlds offer the ideal of living in a world more colorful than the Light World. The Light World is still a Toby Fox RPG. It's not Chris who enjoys being in this Light World, however. So, whose ideal is it? The person who enjoys, or indulges in at the very least, an RPG world the most is the person with the highest numbers in that world, i.e. the strongest person. There are 4 contenders for highest stats in a conventional JRPG context. These four are inherently deeply tied to the design of the world on a fundamental level, in that their very identity is tied to it. The first is the greatest secret boss. Secret bosses represent the notion that there is always something deeper, something greater than you could possibly imagine, something so nestled into the essence of this world that you need to go out of your way to even meet them. Undertale and Deltarune's greatest secret boss is already decided. It's Gaster. It doesn't matter if he doesn't have a fight, he has stats, and he without a doubt fits the bill as the strongest boss. But it's too soon to spill the beans about Gaster right now. We have to cover the main quest. The next candidate for strongest is a party member in the protagonist's party. In Deltarune, we've already seen this concept start to be explored with Noelle in the Weird Room. But like Gaster, it's still too soon to speak about such things. And now, perhaps the most obvious candidate for strongest, the protagonist. The protagonist has effective freedom over their own stats. While they start weak, they can grind and become strongest. As the protagonist, they will be in the player's party the vast majority of the time, if not all the time, thus being provided with constant opportunities to gain EXP. Chris is the protagonist, but they certainly aren't the strongest in the light world. No matter how much the game progresses, they are still stuck at level 1 in that world. This clearly is just another factor to remind us how much they don't belong in that world. This brings us to the last candidate for strongest. The final boss, the antagonist, the bad guy. If we ignore any super secret bosses, something by definition we are allowed to do, the final boss should be strongest in the world in a conventional RPG. That is, at least until the protagonist or a party member surpasses them. So who fits the bill here? The knight, of course. Or rather, the person who became the knight. Now, in conventional Deltarune discourse, we don't exactly think of the knight as a light world denizen. We don't exactly think of them as a dark world denizen either. So the question now becomes, is there a lightener that is a candidate for both the knight's identity and for deserving the role of villain in the sense that they reflect power in their realm better than anyone else? The most on-the-nose candidate is actually Karol. In fact, Karol has a lot of parallels with Asgore, as he was in Undertale, and Asgore was the final boss of Undertale after all. Both run a household with 2 children and experience loss with at least 1 child. Both are strict and cruel in a way that is fueled by a motivation related to losing children. Asgore is fire-themed, and Karol is ice-themed, a complementary element. Both are in the leader position of their society, Asgore as the king and Karol as the mayor. If Asgore is the Mao of Undertale, the conventional JRPG evil king villain, then Karol is the Mao of Deltarune. So, am I suggesting Karol is the knight? No, actually. Think a little bit deeper about the Karol and Asgore parallels, and you'll quickly see what I'm getting at. Was Asgore really the final boss of Undertale? No matter the route, Asgore is not the final boss. Asriel, his son, in the form of Flowey in the neutral route, and in his god mode in the true pacifist route, is the actual final boss of Undertale. And so, let's take a look at Karol's first daughter, Des. Des is cool. Des is athletic. Des comes from a good home. Des is a reliable older sister. Des is able to break the rules in just the right way that only makes her fit in better. The light world is Des's realm. Des even has a strong association with bats, and what's a series of significant influence on Toby in which bats are an important weapon. The Mother series. Ness can wield a bat as his main weapon, and while it could just be a coincidence, Ness and Des are very similar names. Ness was a JRPG protagonist that lived in a world that took heavy inspiration from our modern mundane world over the conventional fantasy settings like the light world does. And we can't ignore the little tidbit that there are 3 instruments aside from the guitar in Des's room, and all 3 of these instruments are representative of protagonists in Homestuck. From Des's perspective, she would be the protagonist of the light world. Well then, how do we extract the connotation of final boss and antagonist from her? Recall Asriel's circumstances. Asriel was the villain, but it wasn't just that simple. Asriel was also the runner-up for protagonist, taking on the role in the player's absence during the backstory. In other words, Asriel was a villain with protagonist-like traits. If Toby was to draw all these parallels between the Dreamers and Holidays only to rug pull us in the most crucial details surrounding Ness, then he's just trying to break the rules at that point. I'm going to determine it's safe to say that, as for Protorune, Ness is in a parallel to the position Asriel was in Undertale. As for the final draft, well, it's a bit more complex, but we'll get there. Let's examine everything we can with Ness and the Knight in Protorune. As crazy as it might sound, if we can solve what Toby had planned here, we can solve his plans for the final draft. There was only one fever dream. First off, it's extremely unlikely that any of the drama with the Dreamers or Holidays was present in Protorune, at least to the extent we see it in the final draft. There's simply too much of a feeling that is playing on what we've already seen of these characters in Undertale to imagine every detail was present in Protorune. That being said, I do suspect something that was in Protorune was Carl and her researching around what is presumably the state of Ness and the circumstances around it. The reason is because Carl simultaneously is the character with most Dark World concern in the Light World, as well as the central character embodying the wedge between Chris and Susie. It's incredibly unlikely that the story would progress without this convenient tension she provides. And so, what exactly are those circumstances surrounding Ness that Carol is researching? Well, hold on tight, because this is where we get into a little bit of esoteric Tobyism. The following may sound like a strange statement, but bear with me for a moment. Deltarune is a retelling of Deltarune. Now, a few years back, this concept might have sounded a lot more crazy, but fortunately, we have Chapter 4 now. Take a moment to think about video games a bit, specifically story-driven JRPGs. Think about the act of playing one start to finish, beating the final boss, and seeing the end credits roll. Depending on the player and the given playthrough, what changes? Well, in one play, a dialogue selection that makes the protagonist a bit ruder might be chosen. Maybe the character the protagonist gets romantically invested in changes altogether. One playthrough, the party might have only fought the minimal required battles, and in another play, the party may have become godly from an early stage. In one play, you went right at the fork in the road, and in the next play, you went left. This is the nature of video games: interaction. However, take a moment to think about most of the story, especially the most important cutscenes. How much of a difference do you see? Did you still make the same friends? Did you still fight the same bosses? Did the word toothpaste still precede the word boy? You see the picture here? There's a prophecy that cannot be broken. Events will transpire, and they will transpire exactly to the specifications of the prophecy written in glass. The glass of your screen that you experience the game through. Your choices do not matter. There's actually another way to word this, or rather, an alternative perspective on this that inherently holds true. Anyone who has read Mieko no Naku will be familiar with this notion. The events of the game have already transpired at the time of starting the game. We are simply witnessing a retelling. The events have already been recorded and programmed. We are simply browsing them in our own way. Think about Undertale for a moment. Whether you left your play on a true pacifist end, or the G route, or spared Frogget every time, or killed a bunch, did you still go to Snowdin before Waterfall? Did Metaton still fight you before entering New Home? Did Toriel still say terrible followed by Reacher? You can have Undertale be told your distinct way, but that telling will always simply be the predetermined set of possible patterns known as Undertale. Your playthrough might be unique in ways, but the events of Undertale are already set in stone. In fact, quite literally a hard, stone-like material. The machine you're playing the game on. A lot of people think of saving and loading mechanics as time travel in the context of Undertale, but it's actually a bit more complex. It's not time that's being manipulated, but rather the state of telling of the story. In other words, hypothetically, it's possible for a character to learn the very story they're a part of before the events even transpire. This is exactly what happens to Flowey in all his resetting, and it's what happens to Frisk and Kara as we, the player, reset. Deltarune takes this to the extreme. The prophecy is a very hard aspect of the world. It's a part of the in-universe religion. Ralse already knows it utterly by heart. Chris almost certainly does. And the way they experiment with seeing if the shadow crystals can warp the prophecy seems to inform us that Chris is not perfectly content with it. And here's where Deltarune separates itself from Undertale's exact mechanics. Deltarune is a retelling of Deltarune before we, as the player, even enter the picture. The very first loop we play already has the marks of us having played before. So where does Ness come in? Let's review the main details we know about the Knight's mechanics. The Knight can make dark fountains just like any Lightner can. This indicates she has a lot of determination. The Knight is extremely competent in battle, at least in the Dark World. The Knight can shapeshift. The Knight is wearing a helmet, which it seems to be able to remove. The Knight can function in some shape or form in the Light World, at least during nighttime. The Knight communicates with and cooperates with Chris. And finally, the Knight's Dark Worlds and Chris's Dark Worlds share the same lighting quality, which is different from Susie's and likely every other character. Now, when we look a bit closer beyond the main bullet points, we get a few incredibly interesting details. Ness is treated as effectively dead in the Light World. Being the Knight certainly isn't a good thing from this perspective. It means Ness lost her normal life in the process of becoming the Knight. And yet, if we really pay attention, she's still overwhelmingly sentient feeling. Normally, when we think of possessed or altered characters, we think of them as losing what makes them what they are. Flowey is a no-brainer example. Asriel is robbed of nearly all of what made him Asriel while Flowey. And yet, the Knight still exudes personality and dissociate with Ness. She even has details such as wielding a bat, or at least something that's sharing a bat silhouette. And her guitar chime plays at 0 volume when Chris optionally reaches out for her off-screen. Strong Ness association is still here. It's almost as if Ness is still Ness, and just simply the way she's able to be Ness has changed. Think about that for a second. The way in which she's able to be Ness. Once again, I remind you, this is a Toby Fox game. It doesn't do abstract powers or world-building details that aren't direct metaphors and often clever meta-reflections on the medium of the video game. What could Ness have been that Ness is no longer? How about a different question? If Dark Worlds did not exist, would Chris still be the protagonist of Deltarune? Would there be anyone to name Chris the hero? Would Chris have an adventure to go on? Deltarune is a telling of Deltarune in which the protagonist is no longer the protagonist, but rather the villain. Now, for all the talk about player soul theory or Chris soul theory or multiple souls theory, there's something incredibly fundamental that was overlooked in all the theorizing. It's the fact that the red soul, at its essence, is a symbol of protagonist status. Recall the description. The cage with human soul and parts. What better way is there to describe someone that is functioning as a protagonist despite not being intended to be one, other than describing the soul as literally trapped in a cage? There's also a similar description. Level 1 human. Body contains a human soul. This language utterly objectifies the soul's containment within the body, as if it is not meant to natively be there. Chris was contrived into the role of the protagonist. How did this happen? Yaster. Yes, Yaster. The catch-all explanation. But hold up for a moment. For once, we're not just going to leave it at that. There is a scientific explanation to go with this. Yaster is a scientist after all, so it's kind of sad he's been fanned into just a catch-all abstract god. Light and shadow is actually a bit of a hidden motif within Undertale. In fact, if you really pay attention, you can find some incredibly interesting patterns associating darkness with imagination and possibility, and light with the corporeal and cynical. Imagery of Flowey spotlit against the darkness is particularly good at exemplifying this notion. But Deltarune is where the motif of light versus dark would take center stage. It's utterly everywhere. In fact, it's so omnipresent that it actually makes it harder to determine the meaning of light and dark. Creation versus destruction. Hopes versus despair. Fear versus relief. Seemingly every time we think we understand the traits of darkness, we find those same traits in light. And despite all this, we know they can't simply be equivalent. The context in which they're found and the things they do just feel too meaningfully separated. When I first dug through Deltarune's motifs for the first time in years due to the arrival of Chapter 3 and 4, the sheer convolution of light and dark had me climbing up crazy philosophical trees about yin and yang and zigzag irony of these two complementary concepts. It got to the point where it felt like a Jenga tower, and adjusting even one piece of it could make the whole thing collapse. It was, frankly, exhausting, and I see why more theorists don't even really bother to sort it out. But in the end, I just sort of kicked myself upon getting the answer. It's a good opportunity to once again remind all of us. This is a Toby Fox game. Toby doesn't like to build his worlds out of complex philosophy. He likes to build out of simple metaphors and then expose the myriad of philosophical applications that can come as a result of that. So with that, let's just step back, take a bird's eye view, and find the one-size-fits-all metaphor to encapsulate light versus dark in the context of Undertale and Deltarune. If you were to describe the ingredients of a video game in just 2 words, what would those words be? There's not many options here. Code and assets, or perhaps logic and fiction, system and imagination, machine and story, light and dark. The reason light and dark feel so interchangeable is because in the context of the medium of video games by which they were inspired, they are both just tools of creation. They mix together, and in a way very similar to light and dark in any context, the line between the two can get very blurry. And yet, they are still distinct. No matter how they may cross over in their function, they always have distinct ways of accomplishing this function and distinct properties when they do so. We've seen this conflict between light and dark even back in Undertale. Perhaps the most obvious example is Flowey's monologue during the G route. Flowey effectively details the journey he went on from seeing the characters and world of Undertale as actually developed people in the manner one would when invested in a fictional story, to being no longer able to see them as anything more than the code and pre-programmed scripting that makes them up. Flowey's perspective went from free and curious within darkness to cynical and trapped within light. This is no different from the way the lights turned on at the end of the first Dark World we explored in Chapter 1. Cynical light dominates the darkness of imagination. The reminder that a mundane, predictable system takes precedence over possibility and adventure. Recall the first prophecy panel after the 2 introductory ones. A world vast in purest light. Beneath it grew eternal night. And so, within the world of Deltarune, vast in purest light, Ness, as she lived, was the dominant figure, and thus the fitting candidate for protagonist. Chris did not fit in this world like she did. But what about the Eternal Night? The Eternal Night is framed as a direct response to the purest light. The easiest superficial reading of this phrasing is the formation of the Dark Worlds. They are the shadow of the light world, a realm of possibility and imagination in response to the light world. Chris does belong in these worlds. Chris is the first chosen hero, competent in battle, and a charismatic leader. Chris can be the protagonist because the Dark Worlds exist. And that right there is the secret to the soul. Chris contains the soul because of being the protagonist. And Chris is the protagonist because the Dark Worlds qualify them as the protagonist. In other words, if the Dark Worlds didn't exist, the soul would remain with Ness, and she would be our protagonist. Chris is quite literally a cage trapping the soul from where it normally would be. Photon readings negative. When we look at this statement with everything about light and dark in mind, the idea becomes incredibly clear. Yaster has found a way to make light function as darkness. he has discovered photons that function as darkness. Literally negative light. The idea here is obvious. It's a system-level support for darkness. In other words, Gaster's experiment, Deltarune, has created system-level support for imagination to manifest as reality. This is why the Dark Worlds exist. The very device known as Deltarune follows a systematic rule set for producing them. And thanks to this system, the story can be told differently than it normally would be, with Chris as our protagonist. This is our explanation for both why Ness is the Knight, and why so many elements of her character are still intact. Ness is the Knight because she needs to be Chris's antagonist. There is a systematic demand for this, because an RPG hero's journey cannot progress without a villain. Note how strange the title of Knight is in the first place. A Knight is more commonly associated with a hero. It's a strange title with a villain, and makes much more sense in the context that this Knight had all the properties of a hero. Toby wouldn't skip taking advantage of the obvious pun either. Ness is the Knight because she is the eternal night, as in nighttime. As in darkness. Darkness forced her into this role. Note the design of the Shadow Guys. Ever wondered why it's similar to the Knight in visual style? Shadow Guys are depicted in the same visual style as the Knight because they are the closest thing to the depiction of a simple human being cast into Dark World form. Shadow Guys are simply the concept of human beings within a Dark World context, taking from a broad set of contexts in which humans could be depicted on television, along with things like the jazz CDs in Asriel's room. In this manner, Ness is also just simply a human being forced into a dark depiction. There is no Dark World that spawned her. She simply is a being of darkness now, thus the simplest depiction of pure black with a white outline. Notice how many Shadow Guys even have animal ears. I highly suspect that Ness, even in Protorune, had her antlers while being the Knight. Recall that Toby specified that humans take on monster forms in the Dark World in Protorune. The antlers would be a symbol of this phenomenon. It's a symbol of no longer being bound to the mundane. Now, it's important to note that I don't think Ness is a human in the final draft of Deltarune, although explaining why will require us to progress farther. We need to finish Protorune first. We can, however, explain why Chris shares gestures with the Knight. The answer is twofold. The first factor is the straightforward fact that Chris is taking on Ness's role. It's only natural that Chris would perform the same gestures while inheriting the very soul of her character. The next factor is something people have suspected since chapters 3 and 4 dropped, and it's the realization that Chris thought Ness was cool. Tenna's dialogue all but confirms this. In fact, it's outright possible Chris didn't just think Ness was cool, but rather outright envied her. They go as far as to confidently play guitar in the Dark World, an action associated with Ness, and in stark contrast the instrument that represents Chris, being the piano. You felt like, whatever you were, for just right now, it might be okay. Chris shows clear signs of not being happy with who they are. The motivation to take on a role that isn't theirs makes perfect sense. Chris even rejects the piano whenever we were directly controlling them, as if saying boldly, it's not a part of being the protagonist. Now, this explains all the gestures except for one. Before the battle at the end of chapter 3 begins, the Knight does a motion of letting her upper body droop. From her face region falls droplets. We need to talk about blood. Despite all the why does Susie bleed debating, and even before that, the sans bleeding debate before chapter 1 even dropped, a lot of people don't stop and notice just how many references to blood in Deltarune there are. I was originally thinking about going over every one of them, but there's actually more than I even realized. It's unfortunate we never got in everything about blood in Deltarune video because it would have been a great resource. One of the first mentions of blood is Susie calling Kei round bloodthirsty. While this doesn't refer to actual physical blood directly, but rather simply the notion of being violent, it's relevant in that it's the first of many references to blood that involves Susie. It also suggests the concept of fighting as something unavoidable, a concept at the time we chalked up to Susie's violent and biased perspective. There's enough consistency throughout the 4 chapters that we can say Suzy is the character most directly associated with the motif of blood. In fact, the first reference to blood is Lancer's threat involving filling the buckets with blood, and he distinctly mentions being inspired by Suzy and how scary she is. The next 2 are very interesting. There's a jar of blood in here? I'll take the blood, and you take the skin. Hearing these lines in isolation, you'd think this is a disturbing horror game. The Heart's Donut in particular is very disconcerting, because Suzy and Noelle flat out believe it is actually blood-filled, despite it being suggested to us to be jam. And this isn't the only instance in which Noelle perceives blood from an item. The Absorb Axe also makes Noelle think of blood. But this is a Toby Fox game. Toby himself said we're not allowed in the club unless we prove we played Undertale. You did play Undertale, right? We know that this game is silly and sentimental. We know it ultimately resolves to character growth and making friends with everyone. Lancer is just a bouncy boy, and Suzy has a heart of gold underneath. But recall a detail of Protorune. You cannot spare opponents. Do you remember what happened last time we couldn't do that? Yeah, we got the G route. But just fighting alone isn't the same thing as a full-blown massacre, right? Well, about that. Let's go back to that purification concept scene in Off. What do we do at the end of every Dark World? We seal the Dark Fountains. And what does this look remarkably similar to? The purification process when fighting Titans and their spawn. Worlds are created just for the ultimate sake of journeying to destroy them. And your level even increases in the process. But we can recruit Darkness to save them, right? Even if Protorune didn't have this, the final draft does. Remember the enemy Wikabel encountered near the end of Chapter 4, relatively close to when we start fighting Titan spawn? 2 distinct details with this opponent made my jaw flat out drop when playing Chapter 4. The first is when you use the act of tuning. Not only does the Undertale attack timing mechanic come up, but Chris actively swings their sword. The second detail is that upon doing this, you're told musical acts got stronger. Is this any different from fighting and growing stronger? There's also a peculiar detail with any water theme enemy as well that people have taken some interest in. When their spare meter fills, they turn pink. This is consistent among all of them and not shared by non-water darkeners, so it's not just isolated aesthetic choices. Let's word this another way. When the liquid-themed enemy's spare meter is filled, they become closer to red. We had at least 3 instances of a reddish liquid or gooey substance being assumed to be blood. First with the salsa in Chapter 1, then with the Heart's Donut, which both Suzy and Noelle assume to be blood. Lancer refers to as blood, even if jokingly. And then finally, with the Absorb Axe, assumed to be based on the ladle that scoops juice in the church, which Noelle perceives as bloodstain should you mod her into your party in Chapter 4. As strange as it might sound, I really can't perceive the water enemies turning pink as anything other than calling to mind blood. Until we finish Protorune, I won't get into the deeper implications of sparing, but what I can say without the slightest doubt of any kind is that Toby is not going to allow sparing to be an escape from violence. It was told to us as clear as day. Our choices do not matter. Violence is unavoidable, and this game is only going to increasingly remind us of this fact as we progress. Chris is headed toward violence. Bit by bit, you can feel the progression. In Chapter 3, the Check Act has the brusque description added to it. Useless analysis. Chris is not interested in these darkeners. Chris is not like those who are moved by Undertale's message about pacifism and kindness. That's why they can't avoid the truth gradually peeking out. When did you start being yourself? Even if Chris takes on the role of protagonist, they can't choose who they are in this world. The Dark Worlds are not only a way to validate Chris's protagonism, they are training grounds. The very first battle we encounter comes with a very strange choice of words from the enemy. I'm just a normal person. Is this a phrase that gives you confidence you should be attacking this enemy? What have we really been doing this whole time? We've been fighting enemies and we've been getting better at fighting enemies. That's what we've been doing whether we've been recruiting or not. It's okay because it's happening in a fictional world, the dark world. We've been growing stronger so that we can eventually be strong enough to stop the knight with brute force. It's okay because the knight is the bad guy. That's how all games work. You wouldn't commit murder in real life, but you would kill a bad guy in a game. Of course you would. It's the right thing to do. And it's not like there's any consequence to it. It's not real, after all. To Susie, the knight has just been a creature of the dark the whole time. The knight is someone who is born of darkness and spreads darkness. They're a threat to the world because they're trying to cover it in darkness. But at the end of the day, they're just another being that isn't real. Just like Darkness, and just like the Titans. It's okay to kill something that isn't real, especially if you're a hero. Chris and Susie's description as dark heroes is, after all, carries out fate with the blade. The blade is what will be used because that's what a hero does. But what about Rouse? Rouse doesn't use a blade, nor does his description as dark hero involve describing one. Records and faces the fate. That is Rouse's description. Rouse's role has been a mystery since the very beginning, and he's a confirmed part of Protorune, so he must be meaningful in some way. As the anagram that forms Rouse's name suggests, it would make zero sense if he was not relevant in a manner that directly relates to Asriel. With Dark Worlds corresponding to idealism so much, as early as Chapter 2, I was nearly certain that Rouse had to reflect a longing for Asriel in some way. As T-Theory showed us, Chris wasn't particularly fond of Rouse. It's not that they hated him or anything, as the value could have been a flat 0 to express such a thing, but it's a far cry from their apparent affection for Susie. I could really only take this one way. Chris wants the real Asriel, and Rouse is a magnification of things that are not convenient for Chris. Chapters 3 and 4 confirmed this reading. Not only did we get confirmation of how much Chris and Asriel enjoyed playing together when growing up, we also got to see an expression from Chris in which they passionately point out the differences between Rouse and Asriel to Susie. But that's not the only information we got. It's not exactly a secret at this point that Rouse treats Chris and the player themselves as utterly synonymous. There's also a lot of hints that he respects the player in soul more than Chris as an individual. He will refer to things from the player's point of view, and he blushes when making contact with the soul, for two obvious examples. While some people treated this as if he had something sinister up his sleeve, Chapter 4 made it clear he's nothing more than a victim of cruel circumstances. If Rouse is favoring the player and soul over Chris, it's because it's his very nature to. And there's only one reason this could be. Asriel and Ness were very close. As they got older, it's possible their affection for one another became romantic, even. Rouse is affectionate toward the player and soul because he's abstracted from Asriel, who was affectionate toward Ness, the protagonist under normal circumstances. He's Asriel's role, but in the Dark World, the version of the story where Chris is the protagonist. As an abstract, he serves as almost a simple parody of sorts for Asriel's role in the story. And that role? To be the engine of inspiring Chris's envy toward Ness. It's so apparent that Rouse's attachment to the player has a distinctly cynical nature in design, even if Rouse himself expresses it innocently. Especially considering Rouse has to learn ground up what it even means to really have an identity at all. Ness's identity is being encapsulated by the simple notion of protagonism, and by extension, Asriel's affection for her is reduced to the simple fixation with the symbol of protagonism, i.e., the soul. From a storytelling standpoint, Chris's role as non-binary locks in the emphasis of this strange relationship triangle. Should Chris have been male or female, we project preconceived notions on what exactly is normal for their relationship with Ness and Atrium. But as neither of these two options, it's so much harder to project what is intuitive for Chris's relationship with either of these characters, especially since both of them defy expectations for their genders to some extent, with Ness being clearly implied to be more aggressive and masculine as a girl, and Asriel known to be on the more passive and feminine side. A complex longing and a complex jealousy can fester here. This is why the keywords boy and girl are distinct motifs within Deltarune. Chris is someone caught between these two things, Asriel and Ness respectively, wanting the affection of one and the traits of the other. The notion of Ralse being a prince but having no subjects has been something that always read as strange to people. But as always, if we stop and view it from a more meta standpoint, it actually makes perfect sense. In the context of classic video games, what do you think of first when you think of princesses? Princesses are something to be protected or rescued by the hero, whom they fall in love with. Princesses are passive in conventional context. They simply wait and observe the events that unfold, while giving the hero a reason to fight the villain, often due to being abducted. Asriel, from Chris's perspective, would fit the conventional princess role. He would be there, caught between Chris and Ness, passively watching the consequences that ensue. And thus, his abstract, Ralse, has the title of Prince and Recorder of Fate. This is where something incredibly disturbing comes in. Somewhat infamous has been these creepy messages in the files, but not encountered in normal gameplay. Is that a cut on your face? Or part of your eye? This one feels like an obvious reference to the sprite we believe to be Gaster, especially when paired with the other hidden message about handwriting. But of particular note is another hidden message. The gash weaves down as if you cry. The pain itself is the reason why. What is all this? Unless Toby is just trying to mess with theorists with creepy red herrings, the imagery of bodily harm here is just too poignant to ignore. And it's not just bodily harm also. There's a very distinct type of bodily harm that has been a major motif of Deltarune, developed right under our noses the entire time. Cutting someone's face. Faces, harm to faces, and blinded eyes. These ideas are lacing Deltarune, particularly in its scariest or unsettling moments. Susie threatening to bite Chris's face off, the angel doll with no facial features, the message that only eyes blinded by darkness can see the way, multiple Spamton references to faces. You've come again to this wonderful place, now tear off the mask beneath your face. Titans shaped from darkened eyes, burning eyes. A comprehensive list would be difficult. It's genuinely everywhere once you start to notice, in little design motifs like King, Queen, and Tenna not having clearly discernible eyes, or even seemingly one-off gags like Queen wanting to turn Noelle's face into a robot one. But most importantly, we have the way in which Titans are fought, by attacking their face, and the very way in which the save point-esque cross symbol on their face brings to mind that Chris can use X/ in the weird route. Deltarune is about faces, eyes, and most importantly, harm to those things. You aren't training to attack fictional creatures. You are training to attack. The edge of the shadow, where reality and dream meet. The final boss is a being of both reality and dream. Ness's screams roar out. The roaring night screams out. Without saying a single word, the blinding slash to Ness's eyes would tell everything. You live in my world now. In this world, I'm the hero. Ness is forever cast into darkness. This is the ending Toby saw in his dream. This is Chris's story. Loneliness, discomfort, and especially envy is what drove Chris to violence. But this is also your story. You honored Chris's protagonist. What drove you to play an RPG in the first place? How many lives did you take in the process? It was to save the world? Why do we need to fabricate a world that needs saving in the first place? What is the purpose of this virtual world? What are you training for? What are you gaining EXP for? What are you practicing killing for? What are you not happy about in the real world? And so, this is Protorune. As shocking as this ending is, I can feel your disappointment. Is that really it? Another you're the bad guy, actually? Haven't we had enough of this trope? When you think about the gimmick of morally testing or rug pulling the player not yet being something Toby hadn't done yet, given Undertale hadn't even been conceived yet, along with the fact that Off, one of Toby's main influences at the time, used this gimmick, along with this trope just not yet being considered controversial or considered tacky back in 2011, it makes perfect sense a much younger Toby Fox would have been drawn to it. And that's the funny thing. Toby himself became disillusioned with this story. Final Draft Deltarune is a very different creature than Protorune, but in classic Toby fashion, he wouldn't just say, sorry, that draft wasn't it, here's something better. As coincidentally has become a point of speculation during the time I was making this video, people have started to question if Protorune is acknowledged within Deltarune itself, and the answer is absolutely yes. Deltarune is a retelling of Deltarune, but it is also a sequel to Deltarune, specifically Protorune. Now, this is where the video was going to end with a big look forward to part 2 message, but one Robert F. Toby Fox decided to announce Chapter 5 within only 2 weeks' notice, cancelling the plans of theorists everywhere. Some say you can still hear the roaring cries of Andrew Cunningham. I have Deltarune solved. If you point to pretty much anything in Deltarune, I can explain how it functions in the story and where we're headed. I'm a storyteller, making my own story-driven role-playing experience like Toby is. I can break down the elements of the story into the exact possibilities of how they must function if this story is going to clutch. I was going to make a sequel to this video proving that, and I still am. There's only one slight problem. I kind of wanted the cred as the guy who solved Deltarune before Chapter 5. Not just the main vector like I did in this video, but really dug into all the nitty-gritty details and explained how they all work. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to explain Toby's thought process after finishing Undertale, the key ways Undertale and Deltarune connect, and then we'll finish off with a shotgun round of key observations and theories I want to claim credit for before Chapter 5 drops a whole new pool of clues and answers on our laps. These will be quick and not carefully elaborated on, although anyone with enough experience in Deltarune theorizing should be able to see what I'm getting at without too much trouble. In some ways, this situation is convenient because Chapter 5 will provide answers to some of the minutiae of the execution I obviously cannot predict. So, with no further ado, here is Howard Room, the answer key to everything in Deltarune. Preview version. Toby made Undertale believing it would differentiate itself enough from his plan for Deltarune. This explains why Kara feels not fully touched on. It's very normal for a writer of little experience to get the illusion two stories won't overlap thematically too much when, in fact, they do. After Undertale, a Toby more experienced in storytelling was now unsure of how to progress. He knew he had something with that ending, as it's genuinely a great composition, with Chris cutting Ness's face, casting her into darkness. He still believed in the core concept of reality and dream meeting. But does it really need to be a message about violence? Isn't that just holding it back? Not only does it add a shallow, propaganda-esque message factor to the game, but it would completely rehash Undertale at a time when the market was becoming less welcoming of this type of lecture the player type game. And so, Toby did some reflection. He reflected on what led to his fascination with video games and RPG mechanics in the first place. Protorune's engine was in the way the entire game is built on the red herring of using a fictional world within the fiction to make the player's dehumanization of fictional worlds diegetic, and then rug pull by revealing everything was just the world. Violence and envy are violence and envy whether they're being channeled through fiction or not. The ultimate question is, do you care about the consequences of your actions? By removing the qualifier of real or fake, you get to the heart of the issue. Not only did Toby realize it'd be in very poor taste to essentially make propaganda that could be construed as an argument for censorship, but he noticed this concept of blurring the border between fiction and reality may offer far more opportunities than he initially realized. And thus, after some struggle, the final draft was built. The final draft is not about violence versus pacifism. It's not about morality at all. The final draft is about asking what drew us to classic video games in the first place. As someone who grew up in eerily similar circumstances to Toby, the words Ram used to describe the original Tenna game struck me poignantly. It's a game about slaughtering everything in your way as you please, and he uses a very distinct word for it: freedom. With the video game industry crashing out and most products being distraction slop no one is genuinely interested in, it can be hard for younger people playing Deltarune to truly understand how much this word captures the feeling of those who grew up playing great classic Japanese games in the 90s, and to a lesser extent, the first half of the O's. It might sound trivial, like nothing more than just millennial nostalgia, but it touches on something fundamental. Classic video games, especially Japanese video games, weren't just media to us. Our relationship with them, and thus Toby's, touched on something absolutely fundamental. Do you value the world you live in? Do you value your hometown? Do you value your family? Do you value normalcy at all? Why do you even bother communicating with others at all? And it's all because video games, especially violent ones, offered freedom. Freedom from society, freedom from weakness, and freedom from others. This is a topic people are scared to discuss, and yet it's a topic that is utterly crucial. It's a fact that people are unhappy with the world we live in. We cannot simply brush that under the rug. But in current year, we've come to see that the video game industry is not our friend. This industry has rotted into nothing and lost whatever artistic and cultural integrity it once had, with rare exception. The freedom we craved was given to us, but it led to nothing good. Toby has found himself in this position left with memories of freedom, a freedom that was genuinely part of his identity, and a world that was betrayed by this freedom. I am in the exact same position, except I found salvation in otaku media, in particular the best creative standards of the culture. Otaku media answers the same concerns that led us to finding solace in video games in the first place, except it's not freedom it offered us, it's hard solutions. But the price is that you sacrifice your concern for the culture and worlds you grew up in. This is the conflict I'm depicting in Orc Castle. While, funnily enough, some people have assumed Orc Castle to be an anti-Undertale game, it's not meant to be an attack, but rather a rebuttal. I want to advance the discussion to something deeper. I want to show the true essence of otaku and where it clashes with the perspective in Undertale and Deltarune. Despite all the memes around his weebery, Toby Fox is not a conventional otaku. Toby never gave up on the world he grew up in. Instead of moving on to a pure otaku perspective on life, he instead chose to cling to memories of games that shaped him growing up, ironically as a symbol of the very environment he played them in, the environment they offer freedom from. These are the factors that came together to make Deltarune's final draft, a story discussing the contradictions between freedom and identity. Hold on tight, because here we go. Deltarune's final draft is a new game plus of Protorune. The story is told again, but with things changed from the initial way things played out in Protorune. This is why the knight has liquid dripping from her face. Her face has already been cut. But the consequences go much deeper. This also explains the Undertale connection. Ness was blinded at the end of Protorune, but she's still the natural protagonist. Her realm is the light world. Now that she's blinded, the world has lost its light, and there can be no more light world because all worlds in video games hinge on them being able to be perceived by the player through the protagonist. What can be done, however, is supplying a new world, created through light. Undertale was such a world. It was a new world, built after Protorune's world was cast into darkness. This is why the DT extractor is reminiscent of a deer skull. A deer is the symbol of protagonism, and nothing is supposed to have more determination than the protagonist. Thus, it can absorb determination from the surroundings, much like a protagonist gaining EXP. Things from Protorune are whimsically altered and manifested. Giftshot is a flat-out parody of Carol. Kara is an abstract of Chris's violence. Azrael is comically attracted to Kara. everyone is a monster in the new light world of Deltarune's final draft, along with Undertale, because even when a new world is created, it's an abstraction born from the pitch dark Ness was cast into. Therefore, elements of Protorune's dark world, such as turning into a monster and things being colorful and whimsical, remain dominant. This is also why Light World and Undertale share UI aesthetic. Sans somehow avoided this completely, which is why he stays human in a sense that his form is a human skeleton that bleeds and doesn't count as a killed monster. The machine that is broken in his lab is some kind of part of the device that made Protorune's light world in the first place, and don't forget refers to him not wanting to forget that world and the people who were important to him in it. Ness being blinded is equivalent to breaking the machine, as Toby hinted at in a very old tweet. While we're on the topic of Sans bleeding, this is why Susie bleeds. Anyone who is a Lightner in Deltarune was originally just a human, so they're going to retain properties of being human. The Light World in general is of dubious integrity in terms of how much it's even able to maintain its consistency of logic, seeing as it's a world that was created to imitate the original Light World, making it closer to fiction in some ways than even the Dark Worlds. This is why you can see the NPCs deteriorate, and the dialogue distinctly treats Chris as capable of violence. If you repeat "don't wait" several times, it can just look like "wait, don't," as in "wait, don't kill me." This also explains the nature of honors. Everything is just an imitation at the end of the day. The original world was lost with Protorune. Next is explaining the significance of cold and ice. The original Dark World was the shelter. Upon its formation, Chris gained protagonist status and Ness the Knight by extension. Chris was now eligible to be a playable character, waiting on Gaster to connect the player to Deltarune. This concept of protagonism and eligibility to be a player character comes from Mother 3, by the way. However, there's a whole set of events that would play out had this Dark World never been formed and Chris never gained protagonist status. Friend in the Tale of Hell is a clear reference to Breath of Fire 2, with the children following the monster into the cave early in the game. Friend is a fabrication by Chris, an imaginary friend they made up to interest Ness and friends into traveling into the woods. Lost where the forest would grow, the children followed the pointed tail. Chris would use the convenience of the dark woods to attempt to slash Ness's eyes. Noelle would be lost in the woods during this, thus Lost Girl. Note that the woods have a major out-of-bounds connotation in classic gaming, often being stacked to mark the endpoint of an area. Noelle's association with the ability to navigate boundary breaking comes from the way in which she would have miraculously found her way to Chris and Ness. Noelle would try to intervene in the scuffle between Chris and Ness, only to be harmed in the process. Ness, as the protagonist, would reset the world to try and not let this be the outcome. Thus, Noelle's action is associated with freezing the story at this point, as this timeline can no longer progress, as it will reset every time it reaches this composition. Naturally, I am not 100% confident in these exact word-for-word events, but functionally, it must be equivalent to this in some form. The lyrics to Don't Forget match up here, and the promise referred to would be a collaboration between Ness and Chris to seek out a better future. Deltarune's final draft is both a retelling of this outcome in which Chris is not protagonist, and the outcome in which Chris is protagonist. The fates mixed together. It was mixed up. The second to last panel of the prophecy reads something to the effect of the first hero. The girl must slay. Chris must be killed, and it must be by a girl. The girl can refer to Ness, Noelle, or even Susie. It's quite likely the game will offer a branching path at the end of Chapter 5 or 6, where Susie can either insist on taking Chris's side, or siding with Noelle once the truth of the fate comes out. Note, a particular wording most people ignore. Only then will the worlds be saved. Killing Chris saves the worlds because allowing Chris to blind Ness results in the light world's destruction, as the true protagonist has lost their ability to perceive light, synonymous with the world being cast into permanent darkness. The same applies to this new imitation light world as would apply to the original light world from Protorune. This also explains why the promise referred to is ominous and seems to be foreboding in regards to Chris. And finally, this isn't as impressive of a prediction now that Toby essentially told us in the new newsletter, but at the end of Chapter 5, the world will be fully cast into darkness, thus calling into question the very order between light and dark in the first place. In Protorune, this would have had immediately led to the final events of the story, where Chris attacks Ness, who is the knight. This is why Gerson tells the story that ends in Chapter 5. However, the final draft, the new future Gaster is creating with us, will progress farther, as the new Deltarune is more complex. In the world covered in darkness, we will come to the terrifying realization that everything in the world is both real and not real. There is no real or not real. There's simply the world. Susie is just as fictional as Rouse, and Rouse is just as real as Susie, even within the fictional story they inhabit. Toby will then test us. Why do we even want to participate in this world in the first place? Do we want a story? Do we want freedom? Do we want peace? do we want violence? The questions will force us to realize that our real world that we live in as the player is just another light world, a machine built out of arbitrary rules. Deltarune will break down the very border between reality and fiction. And with that, the preview of Howard Rune is complete. We are just getting started. All this and much more will be thoroughly explained and explored. Shadow crystals, Pippus, what's happening with the holidays and dreamers, assuming Chapter 5 doesn't spell everything out, Chris's birdcage, Gaster's deeper identity and role. Everything will be covered. In an industry quickly descending into nothing but complete slop, we have reached a point where Deltarune represents a bastion of valuing a game for its substantial aspects, its visual design and storytelling. And I'm making Orc Castle to prove more than ever that what people really want is things of a meaningful experience. I don't have $1 billion to spend on budget like Toby, so make sure to support the Kickstarter. I will absolutely make it worth it for you. The core Orc Castle staff is just me and my brother, the main artist, so every bit of support directly helps development. I'm going to release Orc Castle Chapter 1 this year for free, which will be comparable in volume to that of the content of Deltarune's first chapter. Orc Castle Chapter 1 will shock the world. Mark my words, we will destroy the dying video game industry and build a new industry of otaku storytelling in its place. I'll see you soon.